a bit of an introduction to the sport and society aspect of the A-level. This slide shows you all of the areas that you'll be covering over the 2 years. And most of the stuff we're going to do today on this slide and for your summer homework will cover kind of these areas here, the emergence and evolution of sport. Going to get you to look at a question for your summer assignment that looks at the ethics and deviance in sport, as well as a little bit on something that's pretty topical, which is modern technology in sport. What I actually mean by sport and society and social and cultural, what we're really looking at here is what impact the changes in society and the changes in our cultures has on sport, because sport reflects society. So if you look at sport today and all the stuff that's going on in the news today, you can see how sport is responding to society and responding to the culture and is not separate to it. And therefore, going forward, sport will change because of what's going on in society. And that hasn't just started now, that has been going on ever since we created sport, ever since sport evolved in the sort of industrial period. First part of the course, these are the areas that we look at. We look at pre-industrial Britain, which is pre the Industrial Revolution. So it begins around about 1750, the Industrial Revolution, and wasn't really complete till about 1840. So we can go way back beyond 1750, but we can also go a little bit further ahead to around about 1800, early 1800s, and it's still considered pre-industrial because we hadn't gone through the Industrial Revolution. And then we have that period post-industrial where we are now an industrial country, but we're very, very overcrowded and we're very dirty and industrial, and sport struggles to find a space within that period there up until 1900. And then we look at the 20th century, which is where you see an explosion of sport and participation and spectating into sport. And then we have obviously the period that we're in now, the 21st century. But sport hasn't finished evolving. If we look at football, it hasn't finished evolving once we hit the 20th century and into the 21st. It continues to evolve. So we look at that. So what I'd like you to do here is think about which of these pictures match up with these dates. So pre-industrial Britain, which one of these looks like pre-industrial Britain? And then which sports down here do you consider to be maybe have been played in these periods here? So the answers are on the next slide, but have a few minutes just to have a bit of a look and see what you think before I show you the answers. These are the answers to the thing I just did before, This is a pre-industrial scene. You can see sort of the castle in the background, the lord would live there, and these are the people working on the land, the strip farming here. So very much indebted to them. Now this is actually a pre-industrial sport, even though it looks pretty organised, and that's why it's a bit of an unusual one. This is something called real tennis, but it was very much played by the gentry, the richest and the most powerful and the most important people in the country, and it wasn't played by anybody like that. Lots of reasons for that. Obviously they wouldn't have had the equipment, they wouldn't have been able to understand the rules because they weren't very literate. So that's part of the course, to look at the social factors that affected sport. This is post-industrial, a typical industrial scene, and this is a post-industrial game of football. This is a very, very early game of post-industrial football. You can see there's just a bit of tape across the line. So there was a referee, but what players had to do if they think they'd scored, they had to appeal for a goal. If they didn't appeal, there was no goal. The referee had to wait for an appeal. So there's a bit of cricket involved in there. Lots and lots of players often. They decide on the rules often when they arrived at the match, and they play one half as one rule and another half as another rule. What they also used to do when they scored a goal, they'd swap ends. They didn't just swap ends at half time. So very different to how we have now. It's almost like a game in the park. Also, if the ball went off, it wasn't the person throwing who didn't kick it off. It was the first who got to the ball, threw it back in again. So again, not really football as we know it, and that didn't really come in until about 1880s. Typical 20th century scene, you can see cars and buses. You can see it's the 20th century. This shows you how far we'd come. This is in about 1870. This is 1923. So within 50 years, you've gone from very few spectators and a bit of an old game of football to proper industrial, post-industrial organised football. It's called the White Horse Final because, as you can see there is a white horse trying to keep the crowds at bay. This is a game between Bolton and West Ham United, the FA Cup final. one of the first at Wembley Stadium. You can see no seats, so you can imagine how many people are here. Loads of people got into the ground that shouldn't have done. So the official attendance is 126,000, but they think more like 300,000 went. So you can see what's happened to football. It's exploded in popularity. And there's lots of social and cultural factors why that is. There's the availability of transport, there's more money, there's a more regulated kind of time of work. All of these people are now having gone to school and are educated and understanding it all. So there's a real reason why this is very different. Everybody who played here probably would have gone, almost certainly would have gone to a public school and been an ex-public school boy. But pretty much everybody here would just have been working class, and mostly working class men. So then we have the 21st century, the Gherkin, modern London, and then you can see how footballers continue to change in the 21st century, because we now have VAR and all the technology that's involved in VAR and goal line technology. So hopefully you match them up correctly. You kind of know the answer to this question, because I've mentioned quite a lot of things as I've gone through. So our culture and our society has changed. So some of the things you might want to think about here, I'm just going to give you, you could give yourself a few minutes to maybe have a think of what's changed about our society and our culture from sort of pre-industrial days to now. What's happened during the 20th century? You know, in what ways has our society? Hopefully from that, you would have maybe mentioned some of these things here. We are much less class driven in society now. We're much more equal in our rights, and we haven't quite got the gap between upper and lower class and middle class. The genders, women are much more equal in society now. During the 20th century, they earned the right to vote, or they were given the right to vote. Women's football, therefore, women's sport generally is catching up with men's sport because there is more gender equality. So changing in society, impact in sport. Law and order, at the very beginning of our topic, there was no police force, there was very little law and order, so our games were really, really violent and unruly. Nowadays we have very strict law and order, but we also have law and order in terms of litigation and court proceedings, so we have to behave properly on the football field or any sports field. Education literacy, during our period, many more people can read and write, so therefore access to sport and complicated rules become better. Again, the increase of the railway and air travel has an impact on sport. You can't have a national football competition without railways. So before the railways, there was no national competition. The only thing we had was the FA Cup, but there was no league before you had the ability to travel on the railway. So clearly railways have a huge amount of importance. And time, hugely important time, because again, football didn't emerge, and I talk about football a lot because it's the most obvious and the easiest example to show the impact, because it wasn't until workers were given a half day on a Saturday that football really exploded in popularity, because there was a slot in which to play it. Add to that the ability to get on a train and travel to support your team meant football exploded, and that's why you saw all of those fans in the 1923 FA Cup final. Kind of covered the top two so far today. We've talked about the emergence and evolution of modern sport. We've talked about the sport of the 21st century. We've touched on that. I haven't mentioned really anything else here. So you can see there's an awful lot that we'll cover over the 2 years, but I'm not going to really sort of go through everything in this slide today. I've just sort of talked about the first little bit. And as I said before, your summer homework, you're going to cover something on ethics and deviance, and you're going to cover something on modern technology and sport. Speaking of your summer tasks, these were put in the transition booklet, but I thought I'd put them back on the slide here as well. I'm not going to say anything more than that, because there's plenty here that will get you going and sort of understanding the core. So the first task, as it says there, find an example or find examples of British sports that were codified, it's called, and the governing body was created in Britain. So the Rugby Football Union is a very good example there, but I'm sure if you just put in national governing bodies or the creation of these sports, you'll easily be able to find a pretty long list of all the sports that were codified in this country. Then I'd like you to look at the pre-industrial sports, do some research into sort of sports that existed pre-industrial. I've given you plenty there as well: pedestrianism, mob football, cheese rolling, wheel tennis, hawkings. If you don't know what they are, search them, you'll find them. But also, particularly though, I don't want you to just tell me about them and print off a big sheet about them. I want you to pick out, who's doing them. Men, women, upper class, lower class, both. Why? Why are upper class doing it and not lower class? Why are women allowed to do this one but not allowed to do something else? So make sure you explain yourself here. You don't just print off some stuff that you found about those guys, which I'm sure you wouldn't. Okay, final task really, which again, you should stretch yourself a bit here. Looking at really a hypothesis here. I'm using a little bit of my history here, but there is an essay question in the course for this part of it, and it really is a sort of argument. It's a discussion. So for example, I've given you one here. We will never be able to stop athletes taking performance enhancing drugs. So to answer that question, you need to say, well, what do they take and why do they take them? And then, okay, how do we try to stop them? So what methods have we got that stops them, and is that good enough? So you're going to have to do a fair bit of research here to be able to answer that question. That is not just a quick yes or no answer. Do plenty of research about the issues to do with drugs, why people take them, why it's difficult to stop them taking them. And something a little bit more up to date, VAR should be scrapped and never used in football again. So for that one, probably a little bit more straightforward than the one before. You're looking at why is it so controversial? Why bring it in? What's the benefits of bringing it in, and what are the downsides of bringing it in? But also bring in some examples from other sports about where technology has been used successfully in other sports. So that should be a real debate about the place for technology in sport. Does it take away the drama, or is it really important that we get the right decision, and that is more important than the drama? Or do you think the VAR itself creates all the drama you need and it's even better? So hopefully there's plenty there to get you going over the summer, and I look forward to seeing you when you start next year.